Greetings, swords, dudes and dudettes. I'm going to talk about this sword that has showed up several times on previous videos. It's the LK Chen British 1796 pattern Light Cavalry Sabre. So this is one of the most famous swords, especially from the 19th century, among antique collectors and just in general. It's got a big reputation to live up to. I'm going to highly recommend anyone who's interested going into the history of this sword in particular, check out a channel that's apparently entirely dedicated to the history of the 1796. It's run by Matt Easton, so we'll link that below. This is one of the more recent versions of them that has come out in the mass production market. So for years, there have been a few different models out, one by Universal Swords. I think the Pika has one. Cold Steel has had one for a long time. I owned the Cold Steel model. And for a long time, the Cold Steel model was kind of the best that we had compared to antique originals. I've handled antique originals, and the original version from Cold Steel didn't do it very good justice. Now, I know that Windlass has made one recently that's apparently very faithful to originals, and this model from LK Chen, here I'll pull it out of its scabbard, also should be getting a lot of accolades for being very faithful to the antique that LK Chen must have been basing this on. I haven't seen the original example he's looked at. This combines features from a variety of different examples that I've seen. The shape of the ears, the shape of the end of the tip. These are all things that you can see. Again, remember that these original swords, John Gaspard Lemarchant originally came up with this design for the British Light Cavalry when they were transitioning in kind of the pre-regulation period of sword designs, where there wasn't very hard and fast patterns for the swords at the end of the 18th century. So the model that preceded this was called the 1788 Light Cavalry Sabre, and there's more variation in the design than when the 1796 came out. So right at the period of the Napoleonic Wars, this comes onto the scene, and originally I believe they were produced by Osborne originally, but several different manufacturers produced them, and so you do have variation both in the weight. So this particular example comes in at a little over 900 grams, but you'll find a range of maybe 200 plus grams on antique originals, and slight differences in length and shape and how the different hilt elements all come together. This example slots very comfortably and very nicely in there. So just as an example with what we were working with before, when all we had the Cold Steel available, you had very large peen cap on the end. The distal taper was very linear, so there was distal taper, but it didn't taper nearly enough and not fast enough. So the stock may have been at around 7 millimeters here, but it might still be 5 or more millimeters when you got to the middle portion of the blade, and the foible really wasn't thin enough. It was probably 3 or 4 millimeters out here in the cutting portion of the blade. And so as a result, it handled very heavily. There was too much weight here in the knuckle bow area, and it wasn't a very nimble sword. It cut very well, it was very strong and very durable, but on the whole, it didn't really feel like most of the troopers' examples, and certainly not like officers' examples. By comparison, this one from LK Chen is just very, very handsome in the hand. So as far as what details, it's probably easier for me to mention the things that I think need improvements on, because I'm going to just start singing the praises of the sword itself. So the way that the backstrap and some of the hilt elements have been cut, there's a little bit of an edge and a lip on the example I have. That could probably be sanded down a little bit just to make it so that it's not quite as rough to the touch. The leather has all of the grip grooves very nicely delineated until we kind of get here to the very end where it interfaces with the kind of dove's head style pommel. Then it loses its pattern a little bit. this is a really minor point. Considering that this is a sword that you're going to be paying less than $500 for, the quality both in the grip and definitely once we start talking about the blade is quite spectacular. Just real fast, I'll mention that it does come with a stainless steel scabbard as well, so this is heavily rust resistant. The rings, unlike the the US 1860 model, they don't appear to be brazed together, so these are just clipped and then forced shut closed rings, but I don't see any problem with them at all. They're not going to come loose on you if you decide you want to try and wear this as a piece of costuming kit. It does have a wood-lined scabbard, so when the sword goes inside, and my example does go in very nicely, very smoothly, if I hold the ring still, it basically has almost no movement inside the scabbard. My example is light enough that if I shake it a little bit, it'll come out pretty easily. So the retention on this particular example isn't super tremendous, but sometimes you don't want the sword to get stuck inside. It has the little throat washer here so that it's not banging up against the throat of the scabbard. And as I mentioned before, the languets here again don't seem to be abrading. On historical examples, those could aid in keeping it inside of the scabbard. Right now they seem to be making minimal contact, so it doesn't look like it's a point that it's going to wear on. The rest of the hilt, the one quillon up here, the way that the guard is set, the way that the knuckle bow is set, all perfectly reasonable historical examples. I can't say that it mirrors one manufacturer in particular. I don't know enough about all of the different variants to know if this is in imitation of one manufacturer's style for the 1796 hilt configuration. But this is, again, much better than the offering that I had on the previous sword, which was much bigger, more robust, and kind of overbuilt. That's something that you tend to see on the derivative swords, because this sword inspired many other designs that you can find on the continent. You can find German examples, you can find occasionally French examples, you can find Dutch examples. Even America eventually started borrowing this sword design for some of their sabers, especially officer swords, for example. So the blade is, again, beautiful. The fuller is very consistent and evenly done all the way along it. Minimal amounts of rippling, and my particular example is very, very sharp. Skullagram's been showing off some videos where he showcases what his example of the 1796 can do, and he's doing some pretty impressive cutting feats. However, I noticed that the sword was having a little difficulty cutting through tatami, which surprised me because when I've been doing it admittedly against light targets, this is one of the better performing cutting swords that I have. So to that end, I think that we're going to take it and try and use it against a heavier target. I don't have any tatami right now. I guess I should invest in some, but I'm going to go and put it up against one of those newspaper targets that has a PPR pipe on the inside, or I should say PEX pipe on the inside, and we'll see how it does. So before we get there, again, just mentioning the blade, there's a tremendous amount of distal taper that's historically accurate in that it's non-linear. It's got complex distal taper where it starts thick, it starts thinning out very quickly, so that it goes from 7.5 or 8 millimeters here to just down to around maybe 4 millimeters here, and then it gets very, very thin out here in the cutting portion. Now, something I haven't seen anyone do is test this hatchet tip. So depending on which model you're looking at, some can be very wide, some can be very narrow, but they almost always have a reasonably blunt tip. And there's been a lot of discussion that this tip makes it very difficult to land thrusts. I haven't done my drop test on this one yet, so that will be coming in a future video. But I do have a bottle or two, and if a sword isn't particularly good at thrusting, it tends to just push the bottle off of my cutting stand rather than piercing straight through it. So why don't we try that? We'll test how well this does both in thrusting, and then we'll cut with a couple other targets. So let's move over to the cutting area. Okay, so I have my target here. And again, this is pretty thin plastic, which isn't too easy to cut through if you have a sharp enough blade. In this case, I'm going to try a thrust or two. If it's not particularly sharp enough, or if the profile of the tip is not conducive to thrusting, it's going to just push this off. Hopefully I can get it to give it a good stab, and we'll get some water coming out. If so, I'll try a couple of stabs, and if not, then I'll try and turn it around into a cut. Looks pretty easy, huh? Try one more for good measure. All right. So, at least for this very light target, it did very well at just simple stabs. This is much harder plastic. I will try to land a thrust on this, but this may be a bridge too far. Nope, missed it that time. Try one more time. Aha! I think I did dig into it that time. I'll try one more last time since I haven't split it open. So I landed a little bit of a wound. Now the water's starting to leak out. So the wound was apparently bigger than I thought, and it did manage to pierce this otherwise very hard plastic. This plastic is so tough, I don't know that I'll be able to cut through it now that it has so little water left. I'll try. All right. Even with very little water left, I was able to cut through the bottle. It's very slightly jagged, but again, this is a very thick style of plastic on the bottle. Now, one of the advantages that the hatchet tip offers is that instead of cutting right here in the center of percussion, you should be able to deliver cuts even in the very foible area. So usually if I had a sword that had a very narrow spear point tip, let's say a side sword, an arming sword, some other swords like a Jun that have very reasonably narrow tip, you wouldn't be able to cut right here at the end. For a sword like this that still has a lot of breadth all the way at the tip, you should still be able to deliver decent sized cuts with it. This isn't the thickest bamboo in the world, and it's trying to fall over on me. But I'd like to see if I can land a cut using just the tippy tip of the sword. Let's see what happens. Bamboo, stay still. There we go. Okay, I'm far enough away that I can only reach it with the tip of my sword. Let's see what happens. No problem whatsoever. I probably put way too much power in that because I just cleared all the way through. And again, this shows the properties of having such a mass distribution. You can very quickly redirect the 1796 however you'd like. Even though it's still a cavalry sized sword, and even though it's very wide, it is just incredibly nimble and able to deliver fast cuts, reposition, parry an oncoming attack, and strike back. So you can see why it's such a popular type of sword. Okay, now my newspaper test. So compared to tatami obviously will give you a lot better feedback. It will show you exactly the direction of your cut, if you were out of alignment, if you scooped anywhere along it compared to newspaper. The newspaper with the interior bone analog, in this case PEX piping, tends to be very slightly tougher, I'd say. You can't compare them one-to-one because this is more of a heterogeneous mixture than the tatami, which is even all the way through. But this is a heavier target than I've been testing it on so far, so let's see how it does. Oh, I love that. From the other side. Yeah, cut 2, no problem. So it's going all the way through the paper and through the bone. I'll give it one more cut. See if I can just do like a little wrist-powered number. All right, so with the wrist-powered cut, it skipped off of the bone and didn't cut all the way through. So I'll just pull the bone out so you can see. Here, I'll bring the camera over for a second. So you can see I took a big gouge out of the bone, but it didn't cut all the way through. All right, so my example, which I do know to be, my personal example happens to be quite sharp, and with it being as sharp as it is decidedly a really nice cutter. We expect it to be so. It shares perhaps more in common with older period swords like Langes Messer and falchions than the style of many of the 19th century sabers that started moving towards being more point-centric and cut-focused, which makes sense because even though the majority of these date from the 19th century, this design still is based on some of the swords from the 18th century. Again, this was originally based on sabers from the Austro-Hungarian military forces. So it's a really cool sword if you're into hussars, if you're into British development, especially around the Napoleonic Wars. This is one that you can pick up, and you're going to just have fun just even holding it in the hand. It's really nimble. It is potentially quite dangerous if you're not using it properly, but the offering from LK Chen is really quite neat. I highly endorse it. It's a wonderful addition to anyone looking to add a very historical sword to your collection. Okay guys, until next time, take care.